Very nice to see you all again. Most of you, I think, have been before, but welcome to anyone who's coming for the first time. So, how to deal with 700 or 800 years of history and to identify the sort of key features of the modern age. As I said the other day, modernity, as far as I'm concerned, starts with the end of the Middle Ages, begins with the Renaissance. Today I'll be saying some fairly harsh things about the modern worldview, but before I do, I'd just like to read this cautionary qualification, as it were, which comes from Frithjof Schuon. When the modern world is contrasted with traditional civilizations, it is not simply a matter of seeking the good things and the bad things on one side or the other. Good and evil are everywhere. So that it is essentially a question of knowing on which side the more important good and on which side the lesser evil is to be found. If someone says that such and such a good exists outside tradition, the answer is no doubt. But one must choose the most important good, and it is necessarily represented by tradition. And if someone says that in tradition there exists such and such an evil, the answer is no doubt. But one must choose the lesser evil. And again, it is tradition that embodies it. It is illogical to prefer an evil which involves some benefits to a good which involves some evils. So I will not have very much positive, I will not have very many good things to say about the modern era, but that's just in the nature of the exercise. Of course, there are many good things in the modern world. There are many benefits of modernity, and it would be foolish to deny them. But the question is, as Schuon has articulated so nicely in that passage, the question is, where does the greater good and the lesser evil lie? And my answer is very clear, as is Schuon's. The greater good and the lesser evil lies with tradition. The greater evil and the lesser good lies with modernity. Okay. The other day I gave you a couple of quotes to keep in the back of your mind. I don't know whether you've faithfully followed my advice, but I'm going to give you another one today. This one comes from William Blake, the great romantic poet, visionary, artist, mystic. Man is either the ark of God or a phantom of the earth and water. Man is either the ark of God or a phantom of the earth and water. All right, let's start with something much less elevated. It comes from the American National Science Foundation. This is on its website and in its publications and so on. This is their, not quite their motto, but their, what shall we say, their profession of faith. This is how it goes. Science extends and enriches our lives, expands our imagination, and liberates us from the bonds of ignorance and superstition. Well, is there some truth in this? Well, perhaps, yes, perhaps there's some truth. But are we going to swallow this proposition whole? I could make what I think is an equally plausible proposition, in its own way, perhaps as silly as this proposition. But my proposition would be that science, or more precisely scientism, and I'll explain the difference in a moment, scientism constricts and impoverishes our lives, stifles our imaginations, and imprisons us in new forms of ignorance and superstition. Now, as I say, that's an extreme and reckless statement, but no more so than that coming from the National Science Foundation. So, what is the difference between science and scientism? Let me make it clear at the beginning. I have no quarrel with science. I'm not an obscurantist. I do not want to bury my head in the sand. I do not want to turn my back on established facts. It is scientism where the problem lies. Well, what is scientism? What is science? Well, there are actually two kinds of science. These need to be distinguished before we talk about scientism. There's sacred science and there's profane science. Sacred science we can find in any traditional civilization, any traditional culture. Very, very highly developed sciences. You will know, most of you will know about the traditional Islamic sciences. But, we can turn to ancient India or China or any number of places. Find an ensemble of sciences which can properly be called sacred sciences. But they are of a different order. They're of a different sort from modern science. So today, when I'm talking about science and scientism, I'm really talking about the last 600 or 700 years. I'm not talking about the sacred sciences as we find them in traditional civilizations, and the sacred sciences are still alive in some parts of the world, perhaps here in Prospect College. So science, modern science, profane science, is a method of inquiry. It's a method of investigating the empirical world. You know this stuff. You know this from your high school science lessons. It's experimentation and observation and verification, form a hypothesis, test it out, see if it's right, look at the physical evidence, go weigh and measure and peer down microscopes and all the rest of it. So it's an empirical inquiry. It's an inquiry that depends on the senses, depends on what we can see, what we can hear, what we can touch. Now, as I say, I have no quarrel with that kind of science as long as it operates within its own proper limits. Scientism, on the other hand, is an ideology, and it's actually very difficult to separate science from scientism in the modern world. So scientism is a set of ideas and assumptions which are philosophical, not scientific. And like all philosophical assumptions, they may well be wrong. And in the case of modern science, I think these assumptions, by and large, are wrong. One of the assumptions, for example, is the notion that the empirical method allied with the rational mind is the surest path to knowledge. Well, perhaps it is if we're interested in the, reproductive cycle of caterpillars or something. Perhaps it is the most reliable source of knowledge. But as far as the knowledge of higher things is concerned, it's of limited use, if any use at all. Simone Weil, the French writer, philosopher, very arresting and challenging thinker, asserted that any science which does not take us nearer to God is worthless. Worth thinking about. Any science which doesn't take us closer to God is worthless. This Simone Weil, W-E-I-L, yeah, a wonderful writer, a very provocative writer, and also a bit unpredictable, hard to categorise, hard to pigeonhole. Anyway, on we go. So one of my stalking horses today is Richard Dawkins, as I adumbrated yesterday. So who is Richard Dawkins? Well, most of you know, but some of you perhaps don't. Richard Dawkins is a biological scientist, an evolutionist. And he has written a series of books, and you will get some idea of the fate of these books by their titles. Three of them I mention here. The Selfish Gene. This holds the secret to the meaning of life, the selfish gene. The God Delusion. And most outrageous of all, Outgrowing God is one of his recent books. Outgrowing God. Can you imagine such a thing? Outgrowing God. He's written lots of books, hundreds of articles. He constantly appears on television. He's got honorary doctorates from a dozen different universities, a very widely celebrated figure, especially in Britain. He's constantly on television. And he is the author of the term scientific atheism, which is rampant in academic quarters and elsewhere. And of course, there are many folks of this type circulating, not only in Britain, but all around the place, including here in America. I'll mention a few names to you. These are people who are all more or less in the same camp. They're not all quite as foolish as Richard Dawkins, but they're all of the same general outlook. Sam Harris, Stephen Weinberg, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, E.O. Wilson, A.C. Grayling, Stephen J. Gould, Carl Sagan, many, many more. Let me give you two very short quotes from Dawkins. Children should be taught to ask for evidence, to be sceptical, critical, open-minded. If children understand that beliefs should be substantiated with evidence, as opposed to tradition, authority, revelation, or faith, they will automatically work out for themselves that they are atheists. So here we go. Tradition, authority, revelation, faith, into the rubbish bin. All out, all out. All that matters is the evidence. Well, what's he talking about? The evidence. He's talking about certain more or less established empirical facts, which can be interpreted in any number of ways. But of course, Dawkins only has one way of interpreting these facts, and that is within an evolutionary schema. So today I'm going to be talking about evolution in some detail a bit later on. Here's the other quote from Dawkins. I mentioned this to some of you last evening, I think it was. It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet anybody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or perhaps all three. So some of us are in a lot of trouble. I'm certainly in very, very big trouble. A couple of other quotes from these other characters just to give you a taste. Brief taste. Hitchens. Religion poisons everything. Religion poisons everything. Stephen Weinberg. Religion is an insult to human dignity. This is the sort of stuff these characters are churning out by the day, these kind of catchy little platitudinous anti-religious slogans hitting the airwaves and the media and so on. All right. To return to the general picture before we get into evolutionism in a bit more detail. So we ask ourselves, well, where does the modern worldview come from? Incidentally, when I use the term modernism, I'm referring to a set of ideas, beliefs, values, attitudes, assumptions, a whole cluster of things that all go together. And I'm talking about the prevailing view. Now, of course, we know not everyone subscribes to this view. We're all affected by it one way or another, some of us much more deeply than others, but I'm talking in very general terms about the predominant worldview, the predominant way of understanding. You might put your hand up and say, no, I don't think that. Well, I know that. I know you don't necessarily think this, but this is the general worldview that I'm talking about, modernism. And as I say, I'm talking about the last 600, 700, 800 years, as far as Western Europe is concerned, at least. So what are the key moments? What are the key movements? What are the big changes? Well, first, let's look at the Renaissance. Now, I don't know what you were taught at school, but I remember very clearly what I was taught at school about the Renaissance. It's the golden age. It's the beginning of a whole new era. It's when man frees himself from superstition, from religion, when man becomes the measure of all things. Man is the centre of the universe. We affirm the individual human person. And of course, this has got its positive side, but not when it becomes totalitarian, not when it takes over. Humanism, going back to classical Greece. Again, classical Greece, 5th century Athens and all of that, also lauded in the school textbooks as a kind of golden age. Why? Because it is humanistic. We learn all the statues of the human figure and so on and so forth. Actually, the 5th century, the classical era of Athens, from my point of view, is actually a decline from what preceded it, which was a proper kind of mythological tradition, which became increasingly rationalistic and increasingly humanistic. What does Schuon have to say about humanism? Well, he says a lot of things, but can all be summed up in this short quote. Humanistic culture, insofar as it functions as an ideology and therefore as a religion, consists essentially in being unaware of 3 things. Firstly, of what God is, because it does not grant primacy to him. Secondly, of what man is, because it puts him in place of God. Thirdly, of what the meaning of life is, because this culture limits itself to playing with evanescent things and to plunging into them with criminal unconsciousness. So you can see there in a very short kind of capsule statement, the problem with the Renaissance. It's the Promethean hubris of humanity that it expresses itself most powerfully in the Renaissance. And we get all sorts of new ideas that come into circulation. Now, of course, no one is denying, I don't think even Schuon would deny, that there are certain achievements of the Renaissance which have a certain majesty, which have a certain glory, a certain beauty, a certain meaning. Nevertheless, and he certainly wouldn't deny that, the luminaries of the Renaissance, whether we're talking about art or philosophy or whatever, I'm sure he wouldn't deny that these were people of prodigious talents of one sort or another, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and so on. But overall, considered overall, the Renaissance is the first of the great aberrations, the great move away from tradition. The search for something new, the assertion of human will, of human aspirations, to the neglect of our spiritual aspirations. So the Renaissance, from a perennialist point of view, far from being the kind of golden age that's trumpeted in the textbooks, is a very mixed bag. There are certainly interesting and impressive things that come out of the Renaissance, but it's something we should treat with discrimination and caution. Here's how Lord Northbourne sums up the modern view dating back to the Renaissance. It is anti-traditional, progressive, that's to say the same thing, anti-traditional and progressive. It is humanist, rationalist, materialist, experimental, individualist, egalitarian, free-thinking, and intensely sentimental. I find this last phrase interesting and suggestive. Dr. Nasser, following Lord Northbourne, sums all of this up in 4 characteristics of modern thought. Anthropomorphism, human-centeredness. So humanism would be a manifestation of anthropomorphism. Secularism would be a manifestation of anthropomorphism. So that's the first, anthropomorphism. Second, evolutionist progressivism, the idea that things are moving forward and up. Evolutionist progressivism. 2. 3, the absence of any sense of the sacred. The absence of any sense of the sacred. And 4, an unrelieved ignorance of metaphysical principles. A pretty damaging critique if you go along with it. Of course, a lot of people would laugh this off, so it's absurd. But if we take these observations from Lord Northbourne and Nasser seriously, it means we have to give the whole body of modern thought the most severe interrogation. No one is saying there's nothing worthwhile in modern thought, modern philosophy, whatever, modern art. No one is saying that. But to accept it in the terms in which it is usually presented is to make a grave mistake, to take the wrong path. Okay, In the traditional world, it is recognised by everybody that there are different modes of knowledge and there are different ways of coming to knowledge. How do we know about things? Well, to start from the top, we know by revelation. Truths have been communicated to us through divine revelations. What could be a higher or more reliable or more authoritative source than the revelation on which our tradition is based? Secondly, there's intellection, as I was discussing yesterday. The spontaneous apprehension of suprasensorial realities by the individual person. Intellection being a kind of microcosmic version of revelation. And something I didn't say yesterday, but it's obvious and I'm sure you understand it. Intellection and revelation can't conflict. They can't conflict. Thirdly, there are the scriptures in most traditions. The commentaries that come down over the centuries. They have some authority. That is another source of knowledge. Then, of course, there are the individual faculties we can use, most obviously reason, our rational faculties. We can work things out rationally and logically. Then there are the senses, empirical investigation. Now, I've given you those in a sort of hierarchy, starting at the top and going down to the bottom. Well, what happens in the modern world? Turn it upside down. What's at the top? Empirical investigation. What's next? Reason. What's next? Nothing. It's all gone. It's out the window. Tradition, scriptures, commentaries, texts, sacred art, revelation, intellection, mysticism, all gone. In favour of empirical investigation and dialectics, ratiocination, cerebration, the operations of the rational mind. That's it. That's it. Well, who's surprised that we are impoverished, intellectually speaking, if the only avenues to knowledge are empiricism and rationality? Of course we're going to be impoverished. You'll recall the phrase I quoted from Guy Eaton the other day, perhaps. Our knowledge of trivialities is as prodigious as our ignorance of those things that really matter. Now, ignorance derives from the fact that we, the modern world, have abandoned, repudiated revelation, intellection, scriptures, traditional authorities. One of the things that's most notable about scientism is that it recognises no authority outside itself. Scientists don't consult the scriptures. They don't consult spiritual masters. They don't look to sacred art. Modern science is answerable to nobody except itself. And the general attitude is, well, if the chaps in the white coats emerging from the laboratory say something is the case, then we accept. We say, yes, oh, well, those fellows know what they're talking about. They're very clever fellows. They've studied and got all sorts of degrees and conducted all sorts of experiments. They must know what they're talking about. Not necessarily, ladies and gentlemen. They might know what they're talking about within a very limited field, but it is a limited field. Traditional learning, on the other hand, is something different. Traditional sciences, I'm not going to talk today about sacred sciences. It's not a subject on which I can speak with any expertise whatsoever. But I do want to just read a quote from Whitehall Perry about traditional sciences, sacred sciences. Traditional learning is basically qualitative and synthetic, concerned with essences, principles, and realities behind and beyond phenomena. Its fruits are integration, composition, and unity. Profane academic learning, whether in the arts or the sciences, is quantitative rather than qualitative, analytical rather than synthetic, concerned with appearances, forces, and material properties. Its nature is to criticise and to decompose, to fragment, to analyse, to pull apart, to separate. It works by fragmentation. So this is the sort of crucial difference between sacred science and modern science. That's why sacred science largely works through symbols and modern science works through brute facts. Another important, and for this reason, modern science only really deals with secondary causes, auxiliary causes, cooperative causes, mechanical processes. It can't deal with fundamental forces, supramaterial forces. It can't even recognise that there is such a thing. So it can take no account of anything that it can't put on the laboratory bench. Dissect, cut it open, peer through the microscope and so on. Test it out with various chemicals. Here's another interesting thing about modern science. You've heard the story many times. People like Richard Dawkins are going on with this sort of stuff all the time. Their story is that until the dawning of the modern era, and more importantly, the scientific revolution, which is the second great thing we need to look at after the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, all of these characters mainly in the 17th century, who make all sorts of discoveries about the universe and the heavenly bodies and so on and so forth. The story is that these people showed us how things really are and that we could discard all of our previous notions. So, for example, the idea that the world is the centre of the universe, well, throw that away. We know that's not true. Copernicus has shown us. So this is liberating. This is freeing us from our freeing us from our misconceptions, which we've held for thousands of years. Actually, if you look at it, modern science doesn't liberate us insofar as we accept its philosophical assumptions. It imprisons us, because what are these people proposing? Well, let me come down to the 19th century to make the point perhaps a little more graphically. If we look at the work of four key figures in the 19th century, Darwin, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. These are four characters that are hailed as, in the vanguard of modern thought. These fellows push back the frontiers. What are they proposing? Well, each one of them are proposing that humankind is subject to certain iron laws, certain inexorable laws, which control our behaviour in ways of which we are completely unaware. Is this liberating? Make you feel better? I mean, Darwin, what are we? We're biological organisms engaged in the struggle for survival. The most crucial instinct is the instinct to reproduce. And we're out in that competitive jungle, red in tooth and claw. To put it briefly and bluntly, we're just more highly evolved monkeys. We're not essentially different from monkeys. We just come a little bit further down the evolutionary path. You happy with that kind of picture of yourself? I'm not. Not at all. What about Marx? Dialectical materialism. That's the key to human history. You want to understand the past, you want to understand everything that's happened over the centuries, you want to understand where we are now, you need to apply dialectical materialism. The creative friction and interaction of material forces, by which he means the forces of production and distribution. In other words, it's all to do with economics. It's all to do with money, wealth, which might be in land, might be money, whatever, all to do with the production and distribution of wealth and the dialectic that this creates. And you know Marx's, the way he envisages human history moving through various phases, going back to, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, and eventually a utopia. You know about the utopia? How does Marx envisage the utopia? Well, we mind the cattle and the sheep in the morning, we fish in the afternoon, and we philosophise in the evening, and everyone will be happy ever after. I mean, seriously. What about Nietzsche? Here's a man who's supposedly smashing down the barriers and opening the way forward. I've actually got some time for Nietzsche. I've got very little time for either Darwin or Marx. I've got some time for Nietzsche, but he's a very dangerous fellow. Following Schopenhauer, Nietzsche proposes that the fundamental drive in the human being is the will to power. Most of us are too weak, too cowardly, too pathetic to assert the will to power. But there are just a few individuals here and there, the Übermensch, the Superman, who have the courage to seize their destiny, to exert the will to power, to overcome themselves, and to rise above the human herd, as Nietzsche calls it. But most of us, from Nietzsche's point of view, are cowards. We're pitiful. We're pathetic because we can't or we won't assert the will to power. Not really a very charming picture of humankind, is it? Eh? And what about Freud? Well, we know about Freud. It's all about what he called the cauldron of seething excitations in the subconscious. What are these to do with? You know what they're to do with, ladies and gentlemen. They're to do with sex, sex. That's what it's all about. The Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, rejection, father figures, mother figures, all of that. That's what life is all about. And we are governed by impulses arising from the subconscious, which manipulate us in ways which we're not conscious of. We're like puppets. We're like marionettes being manoeuvred about the place by the forces of the id and the subconscious. Doesn't sound very liberating to me. Or we can move forward into the 20th century, the late 20th century, and think about the postmodernists, the postmodernist theorists that have been so much in vogue in universities in recent times. You know the people, Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Althusser, a whole bunch of them. Nicely called by someone the monks of negation, the monks of negation. Because following Nietzsche, another one of Nietzsche's legacies is relativism, the idea that there is no objective truth. There is no absolute truth. There are only points of view. We think we understand something, we think something that's true, but actually it's just a reflection of our vantage point, our perspective. Now this is not an entirely useless idea, but when it's an absolute proposition, then it becomes very dangerous. And that is the reigning orthodoxy in universities these days. There is no absolute truth. There are only points of view. Have you heard these people? Have you heard this phrase amongst young people? They say things like, oh, well, that's your truth. Someone says something outrageous which is palpably untrue. Well, you can't say that. You can't say that's not true. I don't agree with that. What you say is, oh, well, that's your truth, And there's sort of overemphasis on kind of tolerance and compromise. I like the example of the two people arguing. One person says 2 + 2 = 4. And the other one says, no. 2 + 2 = 5. We all know that. 2 + 2 = 5. First person says, no, 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's all there is to it. So the other one says, well, let's compromise. Let's agree that 2 plus 2 equals 4.5. That's the kind of modern liberal kind of outlook. Let's find a middle ground here. It's nonsense, isn't it? You know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It doesn't equal 2.5, 4.5. All right. Another thing about modern science, it's concerned with life at a kind of subatomic level, these kind of, tiny, tiny, mysterious, I forget what they're called, but you know what I'm talking about, quarks and quantum physics and string theory and all of these things. That on one hand, and speculations about the galaxies and the far reaches of the universe and all of this. Schuon says something very interesting about this. There is something alien. There is something alien in science's obsessive interest in the infinitely small and the infinitely great. Elsewhere, he remarks, the world of atoms, as well as that of galaxies, to express ourselves grosso modo, is hostile to human beings and comprises for them in principle or potentially a climate of alienation and terror. I wonder how you feel when people like Musk start talking about planetary migration. Don't worry too much about the problems down here because later on we'll just go somewhere else. What do you think could actually happen to you if you were shot off to Mars or Pluto or somewhere? I know what would happen to me. I'll go mad very quickly, very quickly. This is where we belong. This is where God has put us. This is where we need to concern ourselves with. So all this sort of quasi-science fiction type stuff about launching ourselves into life on other planets and so on. It's not good. Now, I'm getting to evolutionism, my final general point about science and scientism. The modern mind sets up this kind of conflict between traditional understandings of the cosmos and the human being and so on, and modern scientific understandings. And in some senses, that conflict is very real. But from an appropriate vantage point, it is quite possible to reconcile traditional symbolism, traditional cosmology, with the findings of modern science, insofar as they are valid findings. It's quite possible to reconcile the two. So the fact that the Earth is not the centre of the solar system and not the centre of the universe is not incompatible with a geocentric symbolism if we have got minds sufficiently expansive to accommodate both at once. And in fact, it is perfectly possible to recreate the geocentric symbolism with, solar-centric symbolism. So the idea that there is this irreconcilable conflict between certain empirical discoveries and facts and traditional symbols and cosmology is quite wrong, And in fact, the whole debate about religion and science is often completely misconstrued. The main problem with the debate about religion and science is that the scientific side wants us to take it that what we're dealing with here are two equal things, right? So people like Stephen Jay Gould, for example, very popular, well-known scientific writer. I think he's dead now, I'm not sure. He was very popular back when I was young. That's a long time ago. He talked about the magisterium of science and the magisterium of religion. He said, we can all get along peacefully. Just let the religious folk have their side of things and they can speculate and talk about the hereafter and God and all of that. And we scientists over here, well, we'll investigate the material world. and we'll treat their findings with some respect and they'll treat our findings with some respect, but we keep them separate, two separate magisteriums. The fact is we're not dealing with two equal things. We're dealing with the greater and the lesser. Science can be encompassed within a religious framework. No problem. No problem. The traditional sciences are there to prove it. And even these profane modern empirical sciences can find a place within a religious framework. But you can't go the other way. You can't accommodate a religious outlook within a scientific framework because the religious outlook is so much greater. It is so much larger. So when you see these people on TV having debates and so on, often the person supposedly representing the religious side is all too anxious to cooperate with this view of things. So start compromising. And of course, within the religious institutions, within the religious traditions, this is a very strong impulse in certain quarters, probably much more so in Christian than Islamic, just at this particular moment of history. But you know, Christian churches are littered with folk who are all too anxious to accept the scientific view of things and to then try and find some synthesis of some sort of balance. So, for example, the acceptance of evolution. Now, of course, a lot of the people that reject evolution do so on very precarious grounds. You know, the fundamentalist literalists who want to reject evolutionism on the grounds that, well, scriptures tell us, they don't actually, but they think they do, scriptures tell us that the world's 4,004 years old. In other words, the fundamentalist literalists refuse to accept certain facts which have been established by evolutionary science. We can't go on saying that the world's 4,000 years old. It clearly isn't. And we can't go on saying that all the species appeared together suddenly. And the evidence is overwhelming. The physical evidence is overwhelming. They didn't. They appeared at different times. So although the intuition of fundamentalist literalists is correct, the intuition that evolutionism is wrong, the arguments that are mobilised and the ground on which they stand is very shaky. So that's not really a satisfactory response to evolutionism. There are four kinds of grounds on which evolutionism is vulnerable. I'm only going to talk about one of them today, but the four grounds are: one, just logic. Is it logical, as I was saying yesterday, is it logical that life, consciousness, spirit can somehow emerge from inert matter? Inert, unconscious, dead matter somehow produces life, consciousness, spirit. It's illogical. It's saying that the greater can emerge from the lesser. Then people say, oh, what about the acorn and the oak tree? There's the greater emerging from the lesser. No. The acorn is the oak tree in a very microcosmic form, so to speak. And it unfolds and becomes an oak tree. It's not a matter of changing from one thing to another. The organism just unfolds and grows. But that's not how evolutionism works. Evolutionism, as I was saying yesterday, cosmic dust, algal slime, whatever, and then suddenly life. The one question that evolution has never been able to answer. They've never given even a vaguely satisfactory answer to the question, where did that life come from? They have no answer. They say, well, it just happened. And you press them a bit harder and they say, oh, well, you know, the aggregation of carbon molecules and oxygen and this reached a certain sort of critical point and bingo, life appears. I mean, really, is this credible? Is this plausible? No. Okay, so logical grounds. We can attack evolutionism on logical grounds. We can attack it from the religious fundamentalist point of view, which I was just talking about. So there's some insight there, but it's precarious, not a satisfactory basis for attacking evolutionism. Thirdly, we can criticise evolutionism scientifically. Contrary to what a lot of people think, there are actually many, many, many scientists all around the world, and there have been ever since Darwin, over the last 150 years, hundreds, maybe thousands of very eminent scientists who either have the gravest doubts about the theory of evolution or who are convinced that it's entirely wrong. Dr. Nasser deals with some of these in his book, Sacred, what is it? Knowledge and the Sacred, yeah. If you want to pursue this further. There's some very interesting developments there in the scientific arena. I haven't got time to talk about those, and I don't actually know that much about them, but I know they're there. Or fourthly, we can start with metaphysical principles and see what evolutionism looks like from that point of view. So that's what I want to do now. So I'm just using evolutionism as a case study, just as a kind of example of what I call the reign of scientism. But we could apply the same sort of analysis to all sorts of phenomena. I mean, another very powerful, important kind of development is in the modern world is what we can call psychologism. Gainon said very neatly, very nicely, the 19th century materialism, preeminently Marx, but Darwin also, and others, 19th century materialism closed the mind of man to what is above him. 20th century psychology opened his mind to what is below him. So I could talk at length of psychologism, as I'm going to do with evolutionism, or any number of other modern forms of thinking. So I'm just using evolutionism as a case study because it is one of the most pervasive and one of the most influential kind of body of ideas in the modern world. It's everywhere. Evolutionism is everywhere. So much so that it's more or less invisible to most people. It's just a given. It's a kind of datum. Yes, evolution, that's how things occurred. That's how life appeared. That's how things have developed over the eons. So it's a good subject to choose as a case study. Okay, let me read you. You need to just concentrate for a minute. Just gather your thoughts. Just concentrate for a moment because I'm going to read you quite an extended passage from Schuon, which touches on the kind of key points here. Now we're going for time. Okay. Evolutionism, that most typical of all the products of the modern spirit, is no more than a kind of substitute. It is a compensation on a plane surface, on a horizontal surface, for the missing dimensions. Because one no longer admits the suprasensible dimensions, one seeks the solution to the cosmogonic problem on the sensory plane, and one replaces the true causes with imaginary ones. And if they're not imaginary, they're certainly secondary. Replaces true causes with imaginary ones, which, in appearance at least, conform with the possibilities of the corporeal world. In doing this, one forgets what man is, and one forgets also that a purely physical science, when it reaches vast proportions, can only lead to catastrophe. Transformist evolution, the transformation of the species, transformist evolution is but a materialist substitute for the ancient concept of the solidifying and segmenting materialisation of a subtle and suprasensorial primordial substance in which were prefigured all the diverse possibilities of the a priori material world. The answer to evolutionism is to be found in the doctrine of archetypes and ideas, as they're sometimes called, with a capital I. The latter pertaining to the primordial substance in which the archetypes became incarnated, as it were, by reverberation. Nearly finished. We say not that evolution is non-existent, but that it has a partial and most often quite external applicability. If there be evolution on one hand, there are degenerations on the other, and it is in any case radically false to suppose that our ancestors were intellectually, spiritually, or morally our inferiors. To suppose this is the most childish of optical delusions. Human weakness alters its style in the course of history, but not its nature. All the traditional doctrines agree on this. From a strictly spiritual point of view, though not necessarily from other more relative and therefore less important points of view, mankind is becoming more and more corrupted. The idea of evolution, of progress, and of a single civilization are, in effect, the most pernicious pseudo-dogmas. Evolutionism, as we have it in its modern guise, is a pernicious pseudo-dogma for all of the reasons that Schuon has just said. Now, I can't go into a detailed critique of evolutionism from a metaphysical point of view, but I just want to mention three aspects that are particularly problematic. So one I've already mentioned, which is the origins of life. How do we account for the origins of life, the beginnings of consciousness and all the rest of it? Evolutionist theory they can't answer that question. They do the soft shoe shuffle. It all becomes smoke and mirrors when they start talking about the origins of life with evolutionists. The second problem, the biggest problem perhaps with the theory of evolution, is the notion of the transformation of species. So a lot of what Darwin says, a lot of what he discovered is okay, no problem. Physical organisms adapt to the environment, enhance their chances of survival and so on. Probably true. That's okay. No problem. What is a problem is the notion that one species transforms into another. And of course, the real sticking point here, it's true of the whole schema of species transforming from this to this to this, but the nub of it is the transformation of primates into humans. This is a bridge too far. Schuon again, transformist evolutionism offers a patent example of horizontality in the domain of the natural sciences, owing to the fact that it puts a biological evolution of ascending degrees in place of a cosmogonic emanation of descending degrees. I've talked about this a little bit the other day. Traditional understanding, whatever culture we're in, is that man descends from above, not rises from below. So the whole evolutionary schema has got things back to front and upside down. Man descends from above. Man, like all other creatures, derives from a divine or celestial archetype. There can't be things that are half human and half animal. You can't have a creature that is half a fish and half a bird, because the bird archetype and the fish archetype are quite separate and different. So too, you cannot have a creature that is half monkey and half human. Someone will say, well, why are there so many anatomical similarities between humans and animals? That's a complicated question, and I haven't got time to rehearse the answer now. But if you want the answer, the best place to turn is Titus Burckhart's wonderful essay, Cosmology and Modern Science. It's to be found in the Sword of Gnosis and in various other anthologies, the essential Titus Burckhardt. The Mirror of the Intellect, it's also in there, yes. That is the best, I think, that is the best. Schuon doesn't concern himself with elaborating a detailed critique of evolutionism. He just gives you the metaphysical principles and you can join the dots. But Burckhardt and Nasser, particularly those two, go into it in much more depth. And of course, Nasser has the advantage that he has a little more credibility with this kind of scientific establishment than other perennialists, because of course he's very highly credentialed and well trained in the sciences, so he understands the scientific paradigm, the scientific method, and so on and so forth. So the transformation of the species is a problem, and the third problem is the same problem, but more particularly man's primate ancestry. As I was saying yesterday, if we believe in the soul, can we believe in the evolution of the soul? Can you sort of have a bit of soul and then a million years later grown a bit bigger, a bit more expanded, goes on expanding, you know? So once upon a time we had a sort of soul, half a soul. We were half human. And half human and half monkey. It's a complete nonsense. There are a whole lot of other things that are quite nonsensical. I'll just give you one or two examples. You're getting restless because you're getting very close to 3 o'clock. You want me to shut up, but Dr. Adnan yesterday gave me permission to go for an hour and a quarter today. Yes. I won't tomorrow. Yes. I won't tomorrow, I promise, but I've got till 3:15, so just bear with me for a few more minutes. What am I saying? Nonsensical stuff, yeah, okay. So, the Darwinians tell us about, let us say, a moth which develops a trick. It learns to camouflage itself so it looks like the bark of a tree. So this means this moth can sit on this bark and birds won't be able to identify it. It'll just merge in with the bark. Now, okay, maybe that's how it works. Maybe that's true. I'm not prepared to throw that idea in the rubbish bin. Possibly true, I don't know. How long did this take? Millions of years. Took millions of years to develop this trick. And you can find these adaptations everywhere in the natural environment, you know, birds and lizards and tigers. All sorts of creatures have developed these stratagems for surviving. But it always takes a really, really long time. Now, along come humans. Did humans develop one trick like the moth? No. They developed a more or less inexhaustible supply of tricks, including language. How long did it take? Well, according to Darwinian logic, it should take squillions of years. Should take an unimaginably long time for humans to develop such sophisticated tricks as language. But as far as we can tell, and I'm sure it's right, humans' language is inherent. There's no such thing as a human being who can't speak. The Darwinians would have it that, you know, as I was saying the other day, we start off shuffling and grunting and beating each other over the head with clubs, but we don't speak. There's no such thing as a human being who can't speak. There's no such thing as a spider that can't spin a web. That's what being a spider is all about, spinning a web. And the spider derives its nature and its skills from the spider archetype. That's where we come from the human archetype. Let me ask you a question. We see two furry creatures out there, two four-legged creatures, both about the same size, both furry, both got 4 legs, both got a tail, both got ears. We are not in the shadow of a doubt about which one of these creatures is a cat and which one is a dog, despite the fact that cats come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and dogs, well, goodness me, the variety amongst dogs is infinite. Any number of, you know, from massive great hounds, tiny little pooches. Are we ever confused about whether this creature is a dog? No. Are we ever confused? Is that a cat or is it a dog? I really can't work it out. We know it's a cat. We know it's a dog because somewhere in our consciousness is the archetype of the dog and the cat, which enables us to recognise them as a cat or a dog. People say, no, you were taught that at school and at mummy's knee. Every time you saw a cat, she said, there's a cat. And every time you saw a dog, she said, there's a dog. I don't think so. It's all to do with the archetypes. All right. So there are a lot of nonsensical things in evolutionary theory which are just brushed aside by the evolutionary scientists. And what in fact has happened is that evolution has become a kind of pseudo-religion. It has its own zealots. It has all the rabid intolerance of the worst religious fanatics. They guard the doctrine with unmatched ferocity. Now, in some ways this is funny, in other ways it's tragic, because one very sure way to lose your job in an academic institution these days, unless it's an academic institution of an exceptional kind like Respect College, one very quick way to lose your job is to start talking about evolutionism in the terms in which I have been talking about. You will immediately be branded as some sort of ratbag, some sort of loony, someone who's off the air, someone who's unhinged, to use the popular phrase at the moment, someone who has got no intellectual credibility whatsoever. It's the easiest way to establish yourself as an outcast. Walk into an academic common room and say, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know what? I don't believe in the theory of evolution. They'll be aghast. They might think you're joking. But when they realise you're serious, the atmosphere becomes frosty very, very quickly. So evolutionism is a sort of pseudo-religion, a substitute for religion, an all-explanatory system, which is what all these things I've been talking about purport to be. Darwinism, Freudianism, Marxism. They claim to be an all-explanatory figure. We can understand human history, human nature, the whole kit and caboodle. We can understand the whole thing if only we've got the key. For Darwin, it's evolution. For Freud, it's psychoanalysis. For Marx, it's dialectical materialism, and so on and so forth. Okay, now that's not the end of the story, because evolutionism is not just a biological theory. It's become a kind of social and political ideology. Gainon talks in The Reign of Quantity about pseudo-mythologies. What is a mythology? It's a kind of large explanatory system or framework. A pseudo-mythology is something that's pretending to be that, but it isn't that really. And Darwinism, evolutionism is a perfect example of a pseudo-mythology. And these things come and go, not according to Gainon, not because of an expansion of scientific knowledge or whatever. They come into prominence because the assumptions, the prejudices of that particular point of view suit the age. Now, if ever there was a theory that suited the age as far as Western Europe is concerned, it's the theory of evolution. You want to build empires? You want to conquer other people? You want to take over the world? Theory of evolution is wonderful. It'll do all the work for you. So here we have progressivism. It actually goes back further than the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is not really the ultimate culprit, but it is the most powerful engine of this idea in the modern world. The origins really go back to the Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment, one of the most grossly misnamed periods in all of human history. If ever there was a dark age, it wasn't back in the 5th and 6th centuries, it was in the 18th century. A tremendously frivolous, superficial and sentimental century in European thought. Anyway, what's the idea there? The perfectibility of man. That is the key idea of the Enlightenment. The perfectibility of man and the power of reason. They look around the world, they see all sorts of problems. What's going on here? The lack of rationality is the answer. That's why the world's in a mess. All we have to do is gather empirical evidence and think about it rationally, and we can create at least a very much better world, and for the more wild theorists of the era, a perfect world, a utopian world. All the problems in society are to do with faulty social organisation and ignorance and lack of data. We get on top of all of that, we can make things more or less perfect. We can certainly make them a whole lot more comfortable. So you get this idea that, we learn more and more, we apply science, we be rational, we get educated, we can fix it. Now, I'm not recommending a state of total quietism or apathy or turning our backs on the problems of the world, but this kind of utopianism it's a very dangerous idea. Very dangerous idea. Trotsky, when he was asked about the civil war in Russia, 6 million dead. 2 or 3 years in Russia, 6 million dead, after all the carnage of the First World War. He was asked what he thought about the fact that 6 million people had died in the Civil War. He said, it's a small price to pay for the revolution. And from his point of view, that's quite reasonable, it's quite logical. If you're gripped by this idea that it is possible to create a perfect world, if that is actually possible, then any sacrifice is worth making. 6 million, 20 million, whatever. So it's not just a sentimental idea, it's not just a foolish idea, it's a dangerous idea because it can be used to justify anything, just as science today is used to justify the most monstrous things. Something like half of the world's scientists are engaged in research which is either directly or indirectly to do with military, war, weapons of destruction. Half the world's scientists are not working on making the world a better place. They're working on how to blow people up, how to kill people. You know all the misapplications of science, I'm sure, and the desecration of the environment and so on. All the misdeeds of science. Just let me give you one other example. In the 19th century, there are all these racial theories circulating. Darwin included. Darwin had a sort of racial theory. I've quoted an excerpt from his in other places, and I haven't got it with me now. But what the quote says basically is that over a period of time, the white race will exterminate the black race. And this is a sort of inevitable development. Frightening stuff. Anyway, there are all these people, Rosenberg and Gobineau and Houston Chamberlain and all sorts of people in the 19th century concocting these fantastic theories about different races and hierarchies of races. The Aryan race is in most of these theories, is the kind of super race. And people say, well, that's not science. That's not science. That's just, that's ideological mumbo jumbo. That's not science. At the time, everyone thought it was, well, not everyone, but a lot of people thought it was science. That was science. Phrenology. You know about phrenology? Bumps on the head. Very popular in the late 19th century. All sorts of people do. You get a person, you measure their head, and you make moulds and you see where all the bumps are and you look up the charts and you say, oh, yes, yeah. You see the bump there, very intelligent. Bit of a bump there, yes, quite a good imagination. This, very bad tempered here. Genetic problems, shouldn't have children. It's all taken perfectly seriously by the scientific establishment and applied. People say, well, that's not science. Well, that was science then. The story of science is that at every point, a modern science, modern profane science, not sacred science, modern profane science, at every point, the scientists say, sorry, we had it wrong, but now we've got it right. We used to think that, the body was diseased and all that was affected by vapours and one thing and another. Now we know better than that. So we had it all wrong, but now it's okay because now we understand. And then 20 years down the track, what happens? What they've said here, they said, oh, no, sorry. that was sort of right, but not really right. It's actually like this. That's what will happen to evolutionism. Is it going to take 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? I don't know. I don't know how long we're going to be here. But evolutionism will go the same way as all other scientific theories. They always go that way because they're inadequate, they're limited. They're based on, it's like a pyramid built upside down, or the Empire State Building. You can imagine the Empire State Building built upside down, the whole thing resting on a tiny little foundation. That's what these modern scientific theories are like. So we have to treat them with caution, at least, and with skepticism, and learn to discriminate between what are established facts and what are fanciful theories. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not an obscurantist, and Guénon wasn't an obscurantist, and Schuon wasn't an obscurantist. Perennialists aren't obscurantists. We don't want to deny palpable, established facts. But as Guénon also says, you can take any assembly of facts and you can do whatever you like with them. They can be interpreted in any way you like. So any theory needs to be approached with caution. Okay, there's a lot more that might be said, but my time, 2 minutes early, I finished. 2 minutes, 13 times.